Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decoding DevOps, the podcast in which we break down the key focus area of DevOps each episode and talk about how your organization can realize as much value as possible, focus on work that is meaningful and impactful. My name is Brett Keown, and I'll be your guide today as you adventure through the empowering and exciting world of DevOps. Today, I'm really excited to welcome one of my colleagues, James Hardy, here to join us on the podcast. James is one of our strategic partner leads and is here today to talk to us a little bit about how we leverage security and containerization to achieve some really exciting results for our clients. James, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Hey, anytime. Happy to talk.
Awesome. And James, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do here at Software One?
Yeah, so before coming to Software One, a little bit about my background. I actually started a company that we had grown to multiple franchises around restaurant delivery, one of the originals.
Awesome.
After selling that off, I wanted to do more in tech. That's what I originally wanted to do out of college, was something in technology. So I started working for an MSP marketing and sales company that introduced and opened the door for me to work into Cisco, where I really got my feet wet into the technology world. After Cisco, the engineer I had, we worked very well with each other, helped me get over to Dell. I was actually the last EMC hire on the EMC HR platform. And then a month later, I had to go through it all again at Dell. So a lot of focus on some of the legacy EMC technologies. After that, I knew software was king, and more things are going towards a software-defined infrastructure and solutions. So I wanted to do more around those solutions. So I went to Microsoft. Worked very well with Software One as a partner. So when an opportunity
proving
opened
grounds.
yeah, when an opportunity opened up, I wanted to make the move because I really appreciated what the company did, all that they did for me at Microsoft, and just the atmosphere they had their company. So happy to be a part of Software One.
Awesome. Well, yeah, welcome to the team. We're really happy to have you here. So, at a high level, generally, when we talk about today's topic, when we're talking about security and containerization, one of the key things I found when working with our clients is that there's a lot of fear around using containerization, especially for multi-cloud. And that fear stems from a lack of understanding about how secure it can actually be. They feel that it's not secure enough to meet their standards. But at the same time, I've seen Department of Defense contracts utilize containerization as part of their solution in public cloud spaces, right? And have that be fully secure. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on the disconnect between reality and, what we know from our experience, right, in that space. How secure do you feel containerization really can be?
I feel that it can be very secure. There's a lot of measures one can take. A lot of people focus on their infrastructure as a whole. If you
Mm-hmm.
take some of the same approaches and solutions that we have heard about constantly in the news, and most companies are starting to focus on like zero trust,
Mm-hmm.
limited accessibility, and focusing on some of those things, you can really secure your containers. Some of the misconceptions seem to have stemmed from people who thought the container was already safe using their current infrastructure practices at different layers and not actually taking the time to secure the container itself. One of those being, hey, I've got a base image, we're all set. Things change, your code adapts, it gets added to, applications get added. So making sure your base image is always up to date. You're taking the time to make sure that you're adding in security features to it, you're updating those, updating the apps, and removing anything that may be unnecessary. Um, a lot of times people think, well, just as long as I've secured the applications, we're good. No, it's a multi-layered approach when it comes to security. Every opportunity where you're not securing a different layer is an open window for some type of cyber threat to step in and get your data. It's a play off of the Rudy Giuliani. He had a broken windows philosophy. If there was a broken window somewhere, it was an opportunity for something bad to happen. So
Right.
I've got an open window policy. If there's an open opportunity in your infrastructure, something bad's going to happen because you're asking for someone that you don't want to come in to come in. Um, and then I think probably the biggest misconception I've seen, I was actually reading an article about from Azure Security.
Hmm.
Their founder
Great
Tony actually
publication.
did
Yeah.
one. Yeah, their founder Tony did a publication around code libraries and people assuming they're safe and adding in third-party code libraries without taking the time to vet out what they're using and what they're adding and making sure those are secure, and it's leaving companies vulnerable.
Wow.
Um, so
Yeah,
he
and we
he
have a
gave
lot
out
of clients that are utilizing GitHub Advanced Security and Dependabot to help address some of those types of challenges.
good tools, good strong tools. I think if you look not just from Azure Security and some of the things they publish, but if you also look at things like I think a lot of people look at um, man, it's slipping me right now. The Gartner Magic Quadrant. There you go.
Oh yeah.
Gartner. You're going to look at those tools as highly respected and sought after. But some of the things that people can do around there is making sure you're just doing your regular security checkups, especially of your code, and then penetration testing, making sure that you've got everything in
Absolutely.
place and do assessments and train your people.
Yeah, and the misconception piece that you touched on earlier, I think, is really critical in that a lot of people, when they make the move to containerization as a solution, they take their traditional approach to security and they try to apply that approach to containerization and just assume that, hey, it worked great before, it's going to work great now. But no, you have to have a very specific security strategy around containerization to make sure that you're not opening yourself up to risk and opening up the attack surface. Absolutely, absolutely spot on. Um, you know, when you mentioned some of the misconceptions, but when we talk about containerization and we look at securing container images and ensuring they're not vulnerable to exploitation, what are some of the best practices you think that you could recommend around that for our users?
Well, one way to start, look at the basics. I mean, some of the basic security tools and solutions that we have out there is where you should start. They're there for a reason. Secure your environment as a whole. Look at roles, policies, authentication. If you've got other security tools that you can add for specific applications, definitely do so. And then if you're looking at the container image itself, I mean, keep your images up to date, monitor and scan them on a regular basis. Usually the companies that have a monthly policy of scan, look for vulnerabilities and do those type of checkups, stay
Sure.
ahead. And usually monthlies aren't too hard for large corporations that have a lot going on, especially if you want to secure your data and some of the applications you're working on. And then limit access to the base image as much as possible. Give that to only the people who need it. And also for your active images, not just the base image, your active images, don't throw a bunch of applications on there that you aren't going to need or use. Really set guidelines on what can be added to those for those users. Keep it up to date. Um, because those are where you're going to find those vulnerabilities or where you're going to find headaches later is maybe not doing the right updates on those applications on those containers. Maybe they've got too much access to resources they shouldn't have. So I think really focusing on the roles, policies, and then, like I said, if you can put in some good authentication policies like multi-factor authentication, access to some of the resources,
Yeah.
it can prevent a lot of the headaches that can come across, especially if somebody were to open up a malicious email or if someone's credentials were to get stolen. That would prevent a lot of that because now it's limiting the surface on where they can get in.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, I had a really you talked about the scanning piece and doing it monthly. We had actually had a really exciting project we're discussing with a client right now in which we're going to take and automate that scanning piece, right? So we're going to introduce automation to the scanning so that it can happen every time a change is made to the container itself. It runs through all the testing and scanning pieces and checks for all those things. But the really interesting, but that's pretty standard, right? But the interesting part about it is that we're actually setting it up or the proposal is to set it up so that we can take the security requirements piece, what's being scanned for, and give ownership of that through a front end portal to the security organization, which is separate from the development organization. So they can have oversight into what's happening from a scanning perspective without having to impede or get in the way of the development teams themselves, which I think is just an absolutely fantastic way to approach DevOps.
Agreed. And it also makes sure that they're taking the right steps to monitor and keep an eye on things as well.
Yeah.
So if you're adding security and giving freedom to your people so that they're not being hindered, I mean, that's a win-win.
Yeah, totally agree. So we talked about some best practices, but when one of the things that you mentioned was access controls, and properly implementing those. So how can organizations ensure that their access controls are properly implemented for containers? And what do you think are some of the potential consequences if if they're inadequate?
Yeah. So starting off with the access controls, definitely define your requirements. Who needs access to what and how they will access it. Define roles and permissions for access to the
Hmm.
containers. And as always, limit who can access those resources.
Sure.
Least privilege access is probably one of the big terms kicked around when it comes to zero trust. They always say assume breach, assume that someone's got too much access and
Right.
review and make sure you're limiting it. Because if they need something else, it is much easier to go in and add something that they need than taking away something and then they do use it and now they're upset or they're not using it at all and it's causing problems. So it's much easier for a company to just add something someone needs versus taking the time to keep track or remove those resources. Your access logs, monitor your access logs and logins. Runtime, keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. You know someone's out of town and you see their containers active, their image and all their tools are active, something's not right.
Right.
Either they're skipping out on their well-earned vacation or someone's got access to something they shouldn't have.
Neither which one is
Um,
good.
yeah. uh, Use secure APIs as well. If you use those, you can control access to containers. A good example for Kubernetes, if someone's using Kubernetes, would be RBAC and Open Policy Agent. I
Okay.
think those get used the most, and that's kind of what I've seen. And my experience was people setting up either an RBAC for Kubernetes or an Open Policy Agent.
Hmm.
I mentioned multi-factor authentication earlier. I mean, I think at this point, people really should be adding more authentication tools and resources to make it harder for access. The username and password is becoming a thing of the past. Having devices, having other logins. You've got hello tools that use your face.
Yeah,
I,
especially with
I,
BYOD, right? People bringing their own devices to work and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Me personally, I love the Microsoft's Defender app authentication app where I type in a code, it then gives my fingerprint. So it's a one-time code that exists right there. I get my fingerprint, I access what I need. It's easy, and that means someone also has to have my phone to get in. So, and
Yep.
that's not leaving my side. Uh,
Yeah, you and me
impl-
both.
and then implementing security solutions at the host level and network level as well. Uh, don't just focus on the container. Look at each layer. I'd mentioned that before. Uh, each layer is a potential opening point where someone can get access. So think about each layer and how are you securing it, starting from the container and the applications on it and moving back into the larger resource pool. And then when it comes to consequences, I mean, there are various consequences that could happen if the wrong person gets access.
And we
I
can think worst
mean,
case scenarios, but what do you think is pretty common?
pretty common that I've seen a lot lately is ransomware. Someone gets in some
Sure.
way, pulls the data, locks it up, and then asks for some type of compensation, usually through cryptocurrency, so it can't be traced. And usually, once they've been paid, they get attacked again. It seems the
Yeah.
people who are paying are getting attacked most often, and they're not usually going after the bigger companies either. They're going after commercial and mid-size accounts,
School
and
districts,
also,
hospitals.
yeah,
Yeah.
the SLED accounts, education, higher education. I actually saw a study way back when many years ago at Forbes. I wish I had saved the link, but it talks about how the K through 12 education is probably the most focus point for hackers because those kids have social security numbers. You're not going to know that they've been hacked and someone's using their social
Yep.
to buy houses and such until they're 18. And by that time, they've got
It's
so
too
much
late.
backlog to recover, it's too late. So making sure that you take those proper precautions, it can cost companies billions. It can lose you business and it can shut you down. If you can't recover, what do? You don't exist anymore. You're gone.
Yeah. And I think it's important that for our listeners to understand that we're not trying to scare you. We're just telling you the reality of what's out there, right? But the good news is that you can actually avoid all of this just by implementing a proper strategy before you go down the path of implementing containerization. If you have the right strategy in place, you work with professionals, you understand the risks, you've addressed those risks, and you have a maintenance practice in place as well that makes it sustainable and scalable over time, you don't have to worry about these things, right? But we just like for people to understand what is possible if you don't take those steps. We wouldn't be doing our job otherwise, I feel.
Yep. And there also are good recovery solutions out there for
Yep.
companies as well. Just in case something happens, you can get back up and running in very small amounts of time. And I've seen it where companies have told the ransomware person, yeah, go ahead. We don't need it. We're already back up and running. They didn't
Especially with
need any of this.
containerization, right? Because they can go
Yeah,
back to that base.
exactly.
Awesome. So, we talked about a bunch of different things today. One of the things that I had a client ask me about a few weeks ago, and I'll be honest, I wasn't quite sure to answer it. That's why I rely on experts like you, right? Um, but they were wondering how to secure the communication between containers and external services, right? And that's not something that I've had to do personally before. So, what do you think are some of the strategies for implementing secure communication between containers and external services? And I don't know, how can organizations ensure that encryption is properly implemented? Because I know encryption was going to be one of your first responses.
Yeah. Yes, it was. Encryption was going to be the first response. So if you're looking at that, you're thinking about how can we really protect what's going on with the external services. You can take a look at things starting at the transport layer. Transport
Okay.
layer security encrypts your data. It also uh, can look at a mutual TLS that will require both parties to exchange digital certificates to allow communication between the container and their resources. It's
Okay.
that's bulky and there are a lot of steps in place, but when you're talking about securing an infrastructure, the fact that there can be no communication unless this digital certificate exchange has been done, I mean, you have taken these steps to make sure you know where things are going. And without that digital certificate, there is no traffic. So there is no,
Interesting.
that really locks that up. Not free that up, that locks that up pretty easy. Another easy one, if you're doing stuff on the web, HTTPS. If you don't see the S, it's not secure. I mean, that's what the the S is there for. So avoid some of those URLs that don't have the secure attachments to it and aren't safe to be on. Um, I mentioned API solutions, API gateways is a popular option. People set those up. I think that's something I hear about daily. Somebody, oh, this is our API gateway, and we discuss what they're doing, how they're using it.
Right.
And as always, monitor your traffic. Look at the logs internally, but also externally. Monitor your traffic and communication, tune from the containers. At the network layer, make sure you have the right tools in place so that as traffic and packets are coming in, they're not containing anything that may be malicious and blocking those from even getting onto the network before it even gets to the container. And then ensuring encryption, making sure that it's actually implemented is another thing. Taking the time to actually say, I know my data is encrypted. That's one thing. I'm using these tools. It's encrypted. I know it.
Right.
Do you? Do you know it's encrypted?
Have you
Uh,
tested it and verified it? Yeah.
yeah, so that's part of it. Regular vulnerability assessments, penetration tests for one. Access logs are a great way to review if you're actually have encryption on that data as it's moving to and from. There's actually native Azure tools. So the Security Center has some tools, and so does Azure Monitor to actually track encryption metrics. You can see percentages of data encrypted coming to and from different resources. So you can actually verify that information and actually say, without doubt, here's where it is. And if you've got somebody who's not properly encrypting, because of the logs, you can say this user is not encrypting because I've got these percentage of data moving from them. And you can
Yeah.
actually, that's solid evidence. That is solid data that you can use. And then also your encryption keys. Make sure you've got strong keys. I know that there are some that you can't use. They do generate some pretty strong keys for you that you can use. Some people like to make up their own, something quick and easy to remember. Try to think of something strong, making sure that it's as hard as can be to figure out. I'm a big fan of random number generators when
Yeah.
it comes to access. I use it not only professionally, suggest it professionally, I mean, I use it for personal use as well. So, personal access to information on my personal PC, which my wife hates. She's not in IT.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mine too.
so she is not a fan of the steps she has to take to log in. But have we been hacked yet? No. Has anybody stolen our data yet? No, because I'm
Yeah.
taking the right precautions around key things that we have digitized to make our lives easier. So security is key. And yeah, we use a random number generator on our phones to get access to it as well.
Yeah, the running joke in our house is it really necessary to have a 50-character password on Netflix of random characters and numbers? And my wife just absolutely hates it. But it works, right? I mean, you don't have to go to that extreme, but I do. And what can I say? I'm a geek, right? But you mentioned something a second ago that I thought was really cool, and it reminded me of a conversation that I was having with a client about securing Azure DevOps. And one of the really cool features in Azure DevOps is the ability to create conditional access, right? And being able to use pre-specified ranges of IP addresses or even MAC addresses in some cases to identify exactly who's allowed to access a resource, or not who, but what is allowed. Another solution that we've implemented in the past has been CyberArk, and we've had some really cool success with that, where it's like changed daily. All the encryption keys are changed daily using a platform like CyberArk. Um, so there's some cool stuff there as well. No, that was really insightful, James. Thank you. Um,
And something else to add there,
yeah,
don't assume that any tool or resource you use is giving you encryption automatically. I think people assume it's already there because they use these great tools. No,
yeah,
you've got to make sure it's there. You've got to set that up in some cases. It's on you to do and not the solution provider or the underlying provider of the infrastructure. So if you're using Azure, don't assume it's going to encrypt everything automatically for you. Make sure you've gone in and taken the right steps to encrypt your data.
yeah, totally, totally agree. So the last question I had was around data leakage, right? So how can organizations prevent data leakage from containers? We hear that from clients a lot. It's a pretty common question. And what do you think are some of the best practices for securing sensitive data within containers, especially when we think about things like data sovereignty and HIPAA and all these types of compliance that we have to meet?
Yeah. So just kind of where I think it should start. I think if you're really going to focus on the best first step, start with your people, start with the
Hmm.
employees, educate them, and make sure trainings are done and available. If they don't know what best practices are or what your policies are, they're not going to make sure that they are up to par when it comes to protecting their workloads and data. So educate them, give them the tools and resources so that they can learn this, because I think to date, the number one way people get into any infrastructure period is via email. Email is still the
Yeah.
number one way to get into environments.
Don't click on the
So
picture, folks.
yeah, pretty much. So that tells you who is the number one source of such security failures: people.
Yeah.
So focus on your people. Another thing is go into the best security practices, and make sure you've put in the right things in place. I mentioned zero trust earlier. Always assume breach, that there's some point where they're going to come in. Um, Doing your scans and making sure that you're taking the time to do the assessments. Um, and then making sure that you've got other things in place: encryption, secure your network. Least privilege asset access was another one I had mentioned, where don't give people access to every resource. Limit what applications they can add to a container and their image. Add who can even give them the image. The less people who control that and are working on that base image, the better. And then strong access and authentication practices, multi-factor authentication, different tools, keys, making sure they're not using passwords that my 7-year-old can figure out to
Right.
access their their infrastructure. And another thing, harden your containers. So I've come across this term, hardening a container. Also, you hardening an image for virtual environments. It was something brought up often when I was at Dell with VMware.
Okay.
You can do the same thing with containers. So limit software on each image. Keep up to date with patches. Like, actually have set dates and times that everybody knows. Every week there's going to be just a quick scan. Just stop for a minute, or maybe do it off hours, whatever it may be. Do what you can to keep an eye out for those vulnerabilities. So set up some of those automation tools that you had mentioned for scanning and looking, and do them as often as possible, and allowing your users to put very little on each image. Focus on what is needed for the job,
Right.
and then isolate your containers. So everybody thinks, hey, we would put all our VMs into these into this resource pool, and they can adjust it based on where they need. Same thing in containers. People are starting to have images with base compute storage and stuff that they can access. But if you start isolating those containers from each other, you shrink the attack surface. So you can actually start cutting it off at the container. If you can catch a breach at a specific container and cut it off from the rest of the infrastructure, you've saved yourself a lot of time and headache.
Yeah.
So if you shrink that attack surface, and there's a lot of tools that will keep an eye out for such a thing. So when it does start, you can quickly cut that off. And if you've taken some of the recovery, backup and recovery best practices, you should be able to get that person back up and running on a new image rather quickly without much loss. And then you can focus on fixing where the vulnerability came in at. So hardening containers. I remember that being kicked around a lot at VMware, and it was something that always stuck because it works in many different tools and resources.
Yeah, for sure.
And
Great.
then some of the best practices just to add encryption. Make sure you're encrypting at
We'll
every
say it
layer.
again.
Yeah, I want to add that back in there. Monitor and update as much as possible. Stay on top of security practices at every layer. So just kind of bringing it all home with everything I mentioned. And then above all, educate your people. Make sure they know how to stay ahead of security best practices so they're not your issue. It's the number one. I mentioned it earlier. It's the number one way people get access to infrastructure. Make sure it's not your number one access point to your infrastructure as well.
For sure. Yeah. It, agree with you on all points. James, I just want to thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate the insightful responses and talking about this topic. It's really important to a lot of our clients. And I think one of the key takeaways for our listeners is just you don't have to be afraid of containers. You just have to properly plan, prepare, build the plan, follow the plan, be very disciplined, and work with professionals that understand the risks and understand how to address those risks. Um, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share? Any closing comments?
Other than following best practices, make sure you're staying ahead. There are too many times that you see these C-level on CNN. I would hate to see somebody that I work with end up on CNN having to
Yeah, you
explain
and
the
me both.
breach. Uh, and avoid, oh, I also call them resume generating events. So make sure that you're not having to dust off your resume because you missed one of these security points. So
Yeah.
two things to
Yep.
avoid: CNN and dusting off the resume.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, if anybody wants to get in touch with James, he's readily available to help talk to you about these kinds of issues if you'd like some assistance, or you can reach me anytime, of course. We both work together at Software One. His email address is james.hardy, Hardy, at softwareone.com. Or you can reach him on LinkedIn. I'm going to leave that link down in the description of the podcast because he doesn't have one of the fancy ones like the rest of us. He's been on LinkedIn way too long for that. Um, and yeah, that'll about wrap it up today. So James, let's call it a wrap. I hope everyone's enjoyed today's discussion and has found value in the time they spent with us. Until next time, stay on track, continuously improve, and do something meaningful. Thanks, James. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.